I'm psychologist Dr. Bryan Violet, and on today's episode, I'll be sitting down with fellow Catholic psychologist Dr. Gerard McNicholas. We'll be talking about his reasons for getting into mental health and what he learned in graduate school and his attraction to narrative psychology, and how sometimes psychological theory and the development of coping mechanisms aren't enough when we deal with the immense challenges and sufferings of life. This is the Catholic Center Show. I'm very excited to have you on the show. We've talked about it for a while. You were a little disappointed when you heard that I was going to no longer do the Catholic Center Show. You wanted to come on.
Yeah.
I'm spending a lot of time on the Catholic Psych show with Dr. Greg, where we're reacting to current events, and it's a live call-in show. I'll put a link for that in the description if you want to follow us over there. But I still want to do this regularly, and so I'm going to do it once a month. And so on the triumphant return of the Catholic Center Show, I'm honored to have you on as a guest.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So you are the clinical director for Catholic Psych.
Yeah.
You went to my alma mater, Divine Mercy University, what was formerly the Institute for the Psychological Sciences. I want to talk to you. I think you have I'm very interested in your approach to clinical work, first of all, in the abstract. It's a little bit different than mine. Even though we went through the same program, you can have different professors and different emphases. And, but also I'm more interested in your life and things that have happened recently. I know you wanted to just talk about Frisbee golf. Like maybe we can get to Frisbee golf if we have time, or we can somehow find a way to weave it into our story.
And the Matrix, because I said, once you started doing the movie thing, I'm like, well, that would have been mine, but next time, part two.
I don't think anybody wants to sit around for 2.5 hours while we talk about movies. So I want to trim the fat a little bit, for our viewers, so we can have a little bit of a leaner show and stick with a consistent narrative.
Hey,
see that segue?
I
so
saw
tell
it.
me about why you wanted to study clinical psychology, why you wanted to become a psychologist, and what drew you to it, and then what? Maybe we'll just start there. What drew you to wanting to study clinical psychology?
Yeah, I think looking back, it makes sense that I wound up in this profession, especially as a Catholic psychologist. So I consider myself very fortunate and blessed that the faith was something that was cultivated in my family and my upbringing. And then as I individuated, I was able to, have an experience of it kind of becoming my own, which, I can't say is the same for, all of my siblings in different ways. And so, so that's always been a central part of my life. And then I think, just looking back, I always found myself more attracted to deeper questions, existential curiosities, even as a kid, which, had a shadow side in terms of sometimes those, questions leading to fearful places or what ifs. And so I always found that I was searching deeply, even if privately within myself. And so, and then as time went on, like, even though I had a certain, love of being part of a big family, what started really meaning something to me was the kind of smaller encounters and conversations, even as I, developed peer groups and friend groups. Always awesome to be together in a group, but it was something about these kind of side off, deeper opportunities to get into life, God questions, experience,
individual conversations,
and story, and story. And so, it was always there, implicitly, and there pretty explicitly in terms of the way we communicate with one another. So it was only after the fact, in studying psychology and having kind of like my pick of a theoretical orientation that spoke to me, that when I started learning about narrative psychology, it just seemed to kind of ring a bell that was like a thread through a lot of things that were important to me.
That's cool. Yeah. That's important, right? Pulling a thread through the story of your life. I want to go back to something you said, though. You said there's a shadow side to your interest in psychology and faith. What did you mean by that? What did that look like for you?
I think, an interest in at least, deeper existential questions about, the meaning of life and infinitude and human suffering and and
So
struggles.
there's times of like doubt and questioning. Is
Fear.
that what you mean by shadow side?
Yeah, fear. That I
Fear.
found that myself, wondering, is the next, kid in, second grade or fifth grade, wondering about, existential questions about death and life and what it all means, and where is our freedom and free will, and how can and why does God allow things to
Now,
happen.
did that make it hard for you to connect socially?
I had some good managers. By that I mean interior parts of myself who,
Yeah.
could in a way get along. I think I learned to do that in a big family. You kind of find your place. You find
Yeah.
your niche, and So I never struggled in that way outwardly, but I think
Mm.
interiorly there was always a desire, or a deeper desire for um, a connection with, uh, in the deeper places of life.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated with learning about why people get into mental health. I think outside of the world of mental health, everybody thinks that we're crazy, right? Like the reason why you hear that, but the reason why you go into mental health and you try and help people is because you're nuts. You try to fix yourself.
Yeah.
And especially as men. I mean, men typically are not interested in these kinds of questions, at least in a professional capacity. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, everyone is in a certain sense as a human being, but the deep questions about the psyche, who you are, religion, spirituality, relationship with God, men aren't really interested in that. But I asked you that question about whether or not it was isolating for you, because I remember I remember the first time being hit kind of square in the face with the fact that I was different when I was hanging. I mean, I didn't have difficulties socially,
Yeah.
but I was hanging out with a buddy of mine, and I said to him, "Hey, how's life?" And he goes, "Why you always ask me how life is? Like, don't ask that. That's weird to ask me how life is." But I was like genuinely interested in his life.
Keep your
But it was
philosophical garbage to yourself.
yeah, but he didn't want to go into the depth of how he's doing and
Mm-hmm.
how he's feeling. Looking back, knowing the kid, he he was in a difficult, dark place. Like
Sure, he
knowing
probably
where
didn't
he
want to look
was
within. Yeah.
with his family, right? He didn't want to look within, but it really struck me, and I had to adjust how I would connect with people. Like you said, you had manager parts. I had to really cultivate further manager parts that would hide my
Mm-hmm.
interest in the more important things in life,
Yeah.
because people don't take a lot of time to sit with those important questions. So
Yeah.
I think what I hear you saying is that you kind of didn't have much of a choice. It's just how you were built.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think I've always had some kind of natural, clinical or therapeutic kind of sensibilities about me. And
Yeah.
sometimes I listen to Jordan Peterson talk about the way that he gravitates towards certain kind of qualities of the feminine genius, just by nature of his emotional attunement, his emotional expressiveness. And so I found myself certainly relating to that, although after the fact, getting to know strong clinical psychologists who also who ask deep questions but also have um, a comfortability with kind of entering into some of the more
You
nuanced kind
found
of
your you found your tribe eventually.
yeah. But that talk about like having to learn to hide a part of yourself away. I mean, and then trying to be a teenager going through something of a conversion experience, and then also trying to kind of navigate through my own ambivalence about deepening my relationship with God, while also wanting to continue in the ways of the world, and cultivate what everybody else is kind of after. It was yeah, I would say a number of years, I guess you could say my more prodigal years, where a lot of that was kind of kept more tucked
Yeah.
away, more private, until it let itself kind of come forward a little bit more.
Is it interesting you mentioned Jordan Peterson? I mean, he says that about himself, but I could not imagine going to therapy with that guy. I couldn't. I mean, like
This is
his
how
outward.
analytical he is, or
No, I don't think he's very sensitive at all. I mean, I
oh
don't know
right,
if that's because he has a social media persona because he's trying to get clicks and views, but
yeah,
I find him like so a lot of his ideas I like, and it's great that he's a voice crying out in the wilderness for a set of values that we would generally espouse as Catholics. That's great.
Yeah.
But I mean, my goodness, that guy, he is angry. He's ticked off, and he can be really, really critical of people. I imagine sitting there in the chair and sharing my experiences with him, and him telling me to like suck it up and clean my room, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, I definitely agree with that. I wonder if he's in a different frame as a social political figure.
Yeah, potentially.
And then I don't know if you were kind of privy to this or pay attention to him enough, but after his own kind of trials and some of the crosses he was going through, and then some of those first interviews, at least for a little while, he was emotionally raw, finding himself. And I saw like more than just talking about points of suffering. Like it was one he was moved with gratitude and awe and his deepening relationship with God. Like he would allow himself to feel, I think, like the reality of what was going on. Like I feel like it broke him down to a deeper level of vulnerability. At least
is he even acknowledging a theistic viewpoint at this point? Does he believe in God? Is he still sitting on the fence, or has he come out and said, yes, I believe in God? No, I know he won't say I'm Christian, right, although his wife converted to Catholicism, but is he coming out and saying, I believe in God? Last I checked, he's not.
He would say, Bryan, the devil's in the details. And,
yeah. Or say, why are you interested in my belief in God? It's like clinical jujitsu. Like, answer the question, pal.
Yeah.
Okay. So you had this natural proclivity to being a philosopher and asking existential questions. You have interpersonal sensitivities. You care about people. You care about the emotional life. Then you go to graduate school and you focus. I mean, I was alluding to this before, this focus on narrative psychology. I love the idea of narrative psychology. I don't really know what it is. So without getting too technical,
yeah,
like for all our viewers out there, like in short, what does it mean? What does narrative psychology mean for people? I mean, I know what it means, but I don't know what it means. You know what I mean?
I mean, historically, it kind of grew about in a very postmodern climate. So it was really a way of giving people a greater permission to kind of engage with and tell the personal, the family, the cultural stories that maybe otherwise they weren't allowed to tell or felt ashamed to tell. So it was more about this kind of empowering movement to say,
I have a story that matters.
Yeah, that, and how to say it, to be able to, if we look at like the Me Too movement or any.
I was going to say, was this formed in like a social justice context? This
social constructivism. So it was more of a, I guess a social climate. I think it really came to be more in like the 80s and 90s, where it was just an attempt, and a lot of the work started with different Native individuals. I think the White and Epstein were working primarily in New Zealand for a while. And so it was really trying to give voice and give a power of story to individuals who were otherwise kind of marginalized or disempowered in some ways. So that was at least the socio-political.
I was going to say, you're a white male. So how did it get to the popular audience or a broader audience? Did the theory expanded to include everyone having the right to tell their story, or what?
Yeah, I see it as a kind of providential kind of spark that was kind of inflamed within the world of psychology that just started, I think, attracting more and more individuals to say, like, there's something intuitive about, the way that, we talk about, we're rational beings or emotional beings. We formulate images and words and we articulate, these things and kind of concepts in psychology. But the kind of thing that holds that all together is story. And so look at, the Bible. 80% of the Bible is written in narrative form. It's Dr.
Parables and.
Yeah, I mean, even that's a story within a story, which I know you sometimes refer to, even with Lord of the Rings. But
yes.
Like, we could have been handed a theological treatise in terms of how to know and understand who God is, but we were handed a series and a connection of stories to be able to that much more be able to access and understand the person of God. And so it's really kind of that idea that says, well, we can tell true stories, redemptive stories, and we can also, through our own woundedness, we can tell stories that need updating, that can be false. And so it's the way of engaging with people in their story to help them tell a truer redemptive narrative.
Well, don't think I'm going to let you skip over a Lord of the Rings reference. I mean, I think Samwise Gamgee is the great narrative psychologist. When he talks about how this is my I guess casual. This fits with my casual understanding of narrative psychology, which is that when he talks about how, like, he makes a reference to all the great stories of his childhood. Samwise Gamgee is talking to Frodo. He makes reference to all the great stories of his childhood, and he talks about how the characters and the heroes in those stories like had all these opportunities to turn back, but forge forward. And he's essentially saying, like, we're also in a story, and we're at that same juncture as the main characters in the stories that we loved. And when you think about this from a clinical standpoint, right? So much of us, so many of our experiences and our memories and those psychological processes that inform how we view ourselves and other people, it's almost assumed that the story's over. This is where I am. But it's very relieving in terms of distress to see yourself as in a story, in a chapter of your story, but the story isn't over.
Right.
Like I'm in a story. This is just the most difficult part.
Right.
And that helps with things like anxiety and depression, I think.
Absolutely.
I think now when you start talking about existentialism, and I think the danger of existential psychology is that we just get to write our own stories. Like life is this blank canvas, and we can gather
meaning as
our own
so
meaning.
Choose.
Right. Which would differ from a Catholic perspective, which holds and posits that meaning already exists, and we participate in meaning. Like the Paschal mystery of the life of Christ dying and rising, like that's our story too, over the course of our life. But that's the hero's journey in a certain sense, death and rebirth and all that. But also like day to day.
Yeah.
Right. Like over and over and over, we die and we rise. The meaning that we get isn't like ours to just create.
Right.
But we participate in the ultimate meaning. And and to me, how I understand, I mean, tell me where I'm wrong, but that's like the baptism of narrative psychology, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
Which really Dr. Paul Vitz, who just, spoke at the Integration Summit, which he was one of the first actually I think it was the late 80s, early 90s, started responding to the inherently like postmodern approach to narrative and said, wait a second, the Judeo-Christian tradition is steeped in narrative and story, as like a central epistemology, a way of knowing, what is true. And so like, don't you dare try to kind of, take that into kind of relativistic waters. Like it needs to be held up, in that light. And so he was one of the first, at least Catholic, authors or theoreticians to start approaching.
He was your dissertation chair?
He was.
Yeah, he was mine too. I was at the Integration Summit. I was driving him and his wife around. I was his caddy for the weekend, and his wife very graciously asked me what my dissertation was about, and she was in the back seat, and Dr. Paul Vitz was sitting shotgun. And I said, I don't know, ask him. He wrote it. he wrote all our dissertations. We may have connected some dots, but he's really the brilliant mind. I guess when you're that great, you have doctoral dissertation students to help disseminate your brilliant ideas to the world.
Absolutely. That's awesome. Yeah, true. And if he, of course, was passionate about the idea, it was a joy to see how it just, you were working with a master.
Yeah, for sure. And it brings him to life, and of course we make it our own. It's not entirely his idea, but the essence of the core of the great insight, I think, comes from Paul Vitz. Yeah. Brilliant man, and it gets to all of us. Okay, so now would you say that like you adopt like the way you've gone through graduate school, you're learning about these high level psychological theories. What the most prominent for you, the one you're attracted to the most, was narrative psychology, right? And, we just talked about how that could be helpful in a clinical context.
Yeah.
Now, does that the sort of overarching way in which you cope with life's challenges and difficulties, or are there like other things that psychology offers to you in terms of theory or development of coping mechanisms, how you understand yourself, other people, how you just deal with life's challenges? Like, what has psychological theory like? Is that, have you adopted it as your own? Do you not just help clients with that, but like, do you live according to
internalize
that?
it. Yeah. So when narrative psychology started breaking open for me, and I started hitting up against like more of the relativistic kind of postmodern problem from a Catholic or theistic perspective, there was like a wide open door of integration, but it also was kind of missing a middle place, which was the fact that, do we not have anything within the psychological realm that could be a better replacement for understanding the capacity for meaning making, which is, the fact that all stories about understanding or cultivating or finding meaning. And so that's where, the other big influence for me, I consider myself, indirectly a student of Viktor Frankl. And once I started getting a hold of, the fact that he was so, saturated in, of course, meaning making and story, although a bit more implicitly. So the idea was, what if I started really kind of integrating, Frankl's meaning making kind of paradigm into, what narrative psychology psychologically already is. And so what was always kind of present to me, and once I joined Catholic Psych, things were opened up a bit more, is that, if you study Viktor Frankl's model, I mean, it's deeply Judeo-Christian. It has a lot of strong alignment with an explicitly Catholic approach, and it's all inherently relational. So, he would talk about, the self-transcendent impulse, the desire to go outside of oneself in service and love of another person is the deepest drive of meaning, that we possess. So he had a, inherently relational, objectively moral, theistically based and spiritually grounded model of meaning, and it was relational, at its core. So that was what I was
Relational.
really.
What does that word mean? Relational. I think we toss around that word pretty casually, but I don't know that the average person. I mean, first of all, I actually want to go back one step. So Viktor Frankl, his great gift to the world, for those who don't know who he is he was a Catholic. I think he was a psychiatrist, technically, wasn't he? He was a psychiatrist,
Jewish
psychiatrist that was what's the word? Apprehended and put through the concentration camps during World War II and in Nazi Germany. And he basically discovered, I mean, he makes me feel terrible about myself in a certain sense. In one sense, like, there's a part of me that's like, this is so aspirational. The other part's like, man, I got a lot of work to do, because in the midst of the most abject suffering possible, he discovered that the human spirit can transcend that and discover meaning in the worst of experiences. And then because he's a psychiatrist, he wrote a book about it and then like detailed the psychological functioning associated with finding meaning in the worst suffering. It's like a tremendous gift for everyone.
Yeah.
And so, and you're saying that like what's inherent in his whole book, Man's Search for Meaning, is this aspect of it that's relational. So what does relational mean?
Yeah. And just that I could draw out like why Frankl's work is inherently narrative. Like the psychological teaching, namely logotherapy, that's the second half of Man's Search for Meaning. This is where he's articulating the theory and the approach.
Right.
The first half is his story. He's just sharing his testimony. He's sharing the in and out as a way of saying, like, this is one way to communicate, the reality of what I believe and what I'm teaching. And then the second half is more of kind of a manualized approach, but like we need both. Like he could have just, wrote the book as, here's the approach, but it was the story that we still, remember as being the most, is one of the most powerful parts of who he is as a person. So
he turned it into a methodology.
Yeah.
In logotherapy.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, being relational or a kind of relational capacity is the fact that, he realized that the greatest entry point to meaning, within himself, especially in the most dehumanizing of experiences, was thinking about the person next to him. Like the thing that shifted, between the person who kind of crumbled within themselves and he would say soon after would perish, versus those who continued on was what he would say, that the people who were able to retain that last human freedom that can never be taken from a person, their attitude in the face of suffering. And so he didn't just say like, this is just something we have, so tap into it. He said, you tap into it by orienting yourself in service and love of the other. And so
that's the attitude, because attitude by itself just seems like I don't need it. It doesn't necessarily require another person, right? I just have a good attitude or I have a bad attitude.
Yeah.
But he's saying contained within that attitude is focus my attention on the other person and doing what I can to give to the other, rather than focusing on myself, my own suffering, my own difficulty, my own challenges. How can I look outward from the self,
right,
and help somebody else?
Yep.
Okay. And so
he called that the self transcendent kind of like impulse. He said this was the deepest driving force of the human person, and this is something he developed and thought about before his experience in the concentration camps. And then he had this incredible experience, if you will, to actually put it to the test. And this was actually the very thing that allowed him, among others, to survive, as he said.
Okay. Well, that might be a good segue, because I think over the last year or so, you've had the opportunity to put it to the test. You've had a hell of a year.
Yeah.
And big picture, I wanted to talk to you today about how sometimes psychological theory and psychological techniques aren't enough. I mean, you help lots of people in terms of psychology, but you also integrate spirituality into caring for others in a clinical context, which is so necessary and so important. I often make the joke like, okay, I can help people with psychological theory, but it's not as if Christ was using positive self-talk while he was on the cross. Like, that's not enough.
Yeah, right.
There is something that has to transcend the natural order and the psychology of things. So you've had, as I was saying, you've had a hell of a year. On a natural level, first of all, just becoming a dad for the first time is hard enough.
Sure. Yes.
For anybody.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous adjustment.
Yeah.
And not only that, you had a difficult experience early on with your daughter, where there were some medical issues and health issues, which my understanding of things is that tested some of the psychological coping frameworks that you use to just like deal with life on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. Like, the external environment was more difficult than is typical, and it really tested some of your processes. Can you tell us about the story? Like, what happened? So you're going to have your first daughter. You're excited.
Yeah.
You're a new dad. And then boom, what happened? We're going to do the opposite of Frankl. He starts with the story, then ends with the theory. We started with the theory. We're going to end with the story. So what happened?
I mean, I let me just say, I feel, to put things in context, saying that my experience, now kind of on the heels of Frankl's, is going to be anywhere, in between, connected to that. I feel, kind of humble enough to realize that, true to most things in psychology, I think my experience is going to be, something that, maybe all new parents and especially new men can relate to. I think there's going to be some of that. I think some of it is going to be something maybe only some can relate to. And then I realized, part of it is just a very interior, intimate, experience that, I and I alone, went through. So just a
sure. Yeah, sure. I think maybe what you're alluding to, it should be stated. It's a bad idea to objectively rank people's sufferings. Right. I mean, we started talking about how this man was in the concentration camp. Nobody's saying, like, it's just a bad idea to rank suffering. Right. People's subjective experience of suffering is their own cross, which is difficult enough for them.
Yes. Yes.
And whatever, I mean, people have different levels of gifts, different levels of resources, different capacities for suffering, different amounts of grace given by God. But at the end of the day, we all have to, Father Benedict Groeschel used to say, we all go to Calvary twice in our life, kid. Like, this is one of the more challenging things that you've gone through. No one's saying that this, like, we're not just coming out and saying it's the same as going to a concentration camp.
Yeah.
But we don't want to say, we don't want to minimize how painful and difficult this experience
Absolutely.
was for you personally.
Absolutely. And just as a mention, one more, hook back to Frankl, that when he would work with people, they would be deeply intimidated to share about their sufferings, especially after World War II and after his release from the concentration camps. And he was so deeply attuned to the human condition. He said, everybody has their own interior concentration camp. Like, don't minimize
Yeah, I love that.
your cross, your suffering. Next,
I love that.
just because it stands next to mine differently. But
Yeah.
so we had my wife and I, we had a awesome pregnancy. I guess we can say that. Like, it was a transformative experience for us as a couple. I mean, it really drew us closer together into prayer, into preparation, as friends, and as spouses. And we were very blessed to have a very uncomplicated, pregnancy, which was, good news for us, and it allowed us to really approach delivery, feeling very excited and scared in some ways that new parents will be scared or a bit terrified of the unknown.
Sure.
And then what I'll say is this is, when just fast forward to when we were leaving the hospital. So our daughter, very last minute after she was born, she started having some medical complications that wound up having to rush her into the NICU. And that was basically the start of our family life, was having,
on the way out of the hospital.
I'm sorry. So I was fast forwarding a moment to us leaving the hospital, sure. But just to kind of like paint a picture of, the first, I think, beginnings of an experience of suffering for me was within the hospital. It was this sense of, which I think is quite tremendous, that at the point of myself wanting to be the most empowered, the most present, the most attuned, I am faced with, to a certain degree, the greatest degree of powerlessness and out of controlness, that I've ever had. So it was this great kind of conflict that yes. started kind of shifting tectonically, deep down, even though it took me a while to kind of piece together, what was really kind of moving.
Yeah. And, when you have a child and you're in the hospital, it is the intersection of life and death. I mean, it is in some ways. I mean, the deliveries that my wife has had have been generally healthy deliveries. My daughter had some stuff a little bit, but but it doesn't matter subjectively when nurses rush into the room every once in a while because the heartbeat is speeding up or slowing down, and they're just tracking it. And there's we had concerns about different things, and like it's always something, right? Like I don't know that. I mean, I don't know. At least I don't know of any pregnancies that were just like no problem, easy, no health issues, no concerns, nothing to monitor, nothing to check on, just boom, healthy child, easy. I mean, even if that happens, it's like, is the child breastfeeding right afterwards, or are they not breastfeeding? It's like it's so intense. It's like life and all this joy, but it's mingled with the potential for a lot of fear.
It's immediate
because a lot of things can go wrong. Absolutely. For you, this was amplified.
Yeah. So that so the NICU was just challenging on a lot of natural levels, and then having to in a certain sense part with our daughter soon after she was born and have that separation. It was just this, for me, and especially for my wife, this painful experience of things starting to kind of feel like they were slipping out of what felt very much in our control for 9 months of prior. I'm
surprised you had that feeling though, because especially as a dad, because when my wife is pregnant, number one, her mood changes. But two, it does feel like it's out of my sphere of influence. Like there's this thing happening. There's this life growing separate than me. I can't control it. It just feels, I'm surprised I feel like you hear that you felt like you had a sense of control during that process.
Yeah, it's probably, again, some of my my own parts, needing to grasp or create my own,
You're diluting
narrative
it.
of
Yeah.
a story of control. But again, like I think part of that was like realizing that we have an opportunity here to learn and to pray together, so, and just kind of enter into the experience. So it felt very empowering, in a way,
Yeah.
to kind of take, the bull by the horns in this first experience of becoming parents and having the time and the space to do it. So, fast forward. So, I mean, thank God, a couple of days after our daughter was discharged. And what I was saying before was, although I don't believe in omens, I don't know if you remember the Canadian wildfires. It was about a year ago this time. And smoke was kind of coming down from Canada.
I do remember that. It was, yeah.
Kind of bizarre. And so we were kind of like basically tucked away from, the rest of society for a few days, like within the hospital. And we heard this was kind of going on outside, but that was just not our world. So the day that, and I was warned, like, hey, Gerard, like your first drive home with your newborn, like it's going to be a bit terrifying. So not only that, but it happened to be the day where the smoke and the fog and the haze was just actually its worst. It was like orange, yellow outside. It smelled like a campfire.
Adding to the doom of the experience.
I couldn't even see like 3 cars, in front of me. And so, I mean, talk about a first anxious kind of drive home. So
yeah.
I felt like that was maybe like looking back, like it felt like a certain kind of symbolic representation for what I was like beginning to step into in terms of some of my, my own interior experience and some of what started over the first, few weeks and months start to kind of get brought up within me, and so
God was empathizing with you.
Yeah, absolutely. and so, we had some challenges over the first few weeks and months. Our daughter was, borderline colicky. And so, I know that can be a lot of parents' reality, but it is in some ways, brutal. Talk about a sense of kind of powerlessness, about kind of a lack of answers.
I'm thinking we're skipping past the powerlessness felt by having your child go to the NICU.
Yeah.
And not having your child with you.
Yeah.
And having some fear, like around that. And did you have a sense of what was wrong? Was the communication around it that there was like life-threatening issues associated with it? Or?
Thank God that wasn't it. There was enough issues that they were picking up on that crossed her over a threshold to have to be not only admitted to the NICU, but to be monitored for a number of days. So,
like weight type of issues, things like that. Breathing,
potentially
stuff,
potentially infection, issues, things that seemed abnormal enough to warrant,
to check
a certain intervention, and then, some observation for a few days.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was, to have a room, a hospital room, and then, from my wife. And just beginning to really feel the reality of supporting, her, quite literally first having to, walk down a story within the hospital every, whatever it was, few hours, to breastfeed. And then of course us wanting to stay there as long as possible, but, the hospital policy not being able to sleep within that unit. And so just, the back and forth and then just natural things, lack of sleep, exhaustion.
She's having a hard time walking, I assume, at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that it was somewhere within, those couple of days that I started to just realize that there were older, I should say younger parts of me, starting to kind of like emerge that I hadn't really felt familiar with in a long time. Like those parts of me when I was a kid who started becoming very scared of the questions of uncertainty and unknown and the things that were out of, my control. And so it was, again, the kind of beginnings of this kind of impending experience of anxiety that, although, it was like my head could talk myself out of, like after a while, it was just a kind of growing interior experience of something that, became over, some time more and more kind of difficult to just cope with.
Yeah. So the self-talk type of, kind of surfacey level psychological defense mechanisms like didn't work anymore.
Right. Right. Over
Yeah.
time.
And so like the emotions over time. Okay. So like gradually became more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the emotions caught up to you.
Yeah, I think so. And, um, it was, returning home. And then, I remember talking to you, it's pretty soon after something. So a couple of weeks, passed, and just the normal wonderful and challenging kind of dimensions of experience returning to work after paternity. And
Yeah.
in a seemingly random evening, our daughter went into a medical crisis and emergency that, after bringing her to the ER and staying in the hospital again, it was diagnosed as what they call a BRUI, which is a brief, resolved, unexplained event. And so it's actually
That's like the most vague, unhelpful diagnosis I've ever heard in my
it's a
life.
diagnosis of exclusion. And so, in other words, they do a whole battery and series of tests to
Yeah.
try to figure out if it's anything major. And when all of those tests, come back negative, this is the kind of diagnostic label that they give. So, in one way, after this, I mean,
Terrifying.
terrifying, terrifying. Uh, the effect of respiration and body posture. It was yeah, it was horrible. And
Yeah.
so to get that diagnosis, it was like, on one hand, it was relieving, that it wasn't something more serious, and in another way, it was just this open
Question mark.
chasm of
Yeah.
uncertainty about what it truly was. And the question that we were asking the doctors: will this happen again? Will
Now,
this?
did you feel responsibility? Where were you in terms of allowing yourself to feel? Like, did you feel like you had to take care of your wife, or was she taking care of you? Were you taking turns? Like, what was that
Care?
like in terms of like burying your emotions about how challenging it was?
um I think, I mean, generally speaking, like, I was well aware over these first few weeks and months that there was a call and a responsibility that I felt very connected to to be, present, supportive, and as helpful,
Stable. Yeah.
stable, as I possibly could be for her through, of course, all of the pregnancy, but then especially through labor and delivery, and then these first couple of weeks and months home. So, in a way, I think that was part of the um, I think the eventual kind of limitation of some of these coping skills was because of the reality that I wanted to at once be honoring, the need and the desire within myself to be present and supportive of her. And I think, in that, there was just a growing, void and need within myself for, for a place to kind of talk through things and have more support for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So I imagine at some point, yeah, with kind of like everything breaking down. I mean, I, I hear you talking about it in somewhat of a distanced way, which is probably uh, one of the ways in which you've coped with it.
Yeah.
There's a real kind of earthy, emotive part of me
Mm.
that wants to just enter into that space of how terrifying,
Mm.
how lonely, how confusing, and that time is, and because I know just having a child is adjustment enough,
Hmm.
and to have that added layer, I mean, I can't help but think about how brutal that was. So, what did you do to sort of like get through the experience?
Um,
If the regular psychology coping mechanisms weren't quite working,
yeah. Yeah.
and you're riding the wave a bit,
Hmm. Hmm.
what was helpful for you in terms of dealing with the immensity of the suffering from, I mean, subjective suffering, but suffering.
Yeah, I think it was my attempt to just keep a continuation of what up until these first couple of weeks and months had been incredibly helpful and stabilizing for me. I mean, just my own places of support in my life, my own steps of taking care of myself, nutrition, exercise, prayer, meditation.
But it's interesting because the message from Frankl was you'll get through your worst suffering if you focus on other people.
Mm-hmm.
But during this time period, you were certainly focused on other people.
Right.
But interiorly, you were still kind of breaking down because you weren't focusing on yourself enough.
Right.
Is that fair to say? So
yeah.
like Frankl's only got half the story. Like how do we make sense of that disconnect?
Yeah. Well, I think I was the one who was suffering now, and my willingness to allow another to start attending to my own experience, my own deeper pain, my own deeper fears. And so, that really was in my, experience, where the end of psychology and the beginning of a deeper spiritual, experience and invitation of particularly God the Father, started, breaking into my life. As I learned, more and more of not only attending to my own experience, but looking back on it, like it's interesting that and important that supposedly up to 10% of men will deal with postpartum, peripartum, issues with depression and anxiety. And not only that, but I found this not only interesting, but also true to my experience that whereas women will come upon those difficulties usually within the first few weeks of giving birth, for men, it's a delayed response. And usually within 3 to 6 months, which is precisely when I felt as though, things were kind of coming, more and more to ahead for me. And I was always curious about, why that is. And my guess, personal impression is that, I think men and myself included are good at using what we know until what we know doesn't work anymore. So
yes, that's what drives men into therapy in general.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to rely on other people.
Right.
And so this sort of sense of staking our claim in the world and being independent is all good and well until we don't have the flexibility to adjust to life's demands.
Right.
And the byproduct is anxiety and depression, right? It's like our interior architecture of personality works until the environment doesn't allow it to work anymore. And we have to learn to be flexible enough to change. But if we don't, that grinding between the two, the incongruence, the byproduct is anxiety and depression.
Right.
And that's when we get men coming into mentorship or therapy, seeking help. But just as soon as you can help them get back to like not feeling this way anymore, they want to go back on their own.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't deeply internalize the need for others in that way. It's a very Western, very American approach to
very masculine in certain ways.
Masculine construct,
sure.
I would say.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. No. So that was, I think, a severe mercy, that was offered, to me was, allowing me to, try to, I think, carry, the cross and the burden as far as I potentially could before, I was kind of face down in a way, and ready to move into a deeper, what I experience as a deeper spiritual surrender and a willingness to really engage in redemptive suffering and meaning in a way that I had never before.
Let's put some flesh on those bones, some meat on those bones. What does that look like for you now?
Well,
a deeper trust, a deeper abandonment, a deeper
Yeah.
connection with God the Father. So what does that amount to?
Yeah. I, I think, what I started putting into place is everything I would recommend to anybody who I was ever working with or walking with, which is to, realize that I think the moral is not that coping skills don't work, and so like out with that. It's like, no, actually, the ways you cope are now essentially important, but to insulate and hold a greater ability to, I mean, first and foremost, wait upon the Lord. Like I felt as though there was um, a great humility within myself to realize that I can't act like a father, you know, anymore. I need to allow myself to start becoming a father, and so just a willingness to be humble, a willingness to begin opening myself up to others, to begin receiving, support in different ways. Um,
What
really,
was the best way? What was the best way you received support that was new?
um, so when I was coming through like my reversion experience when I was 20 20 or so, I connected with a an amazing Christian counselor, and he helped basically kind of like shape in a deeper way my desire and my passion for going on to studying psychology. So
Sure.
um, also a very fatherly man, and so
Hmm.
in I think in the kind of like height of my recognition of needing to practice what I preach in a way and open myself up to the love of the Father in many different ways. He came to mind, and sure enough, a few decades later, I gave
Hmm.
him a buzz, and we reconnected. Years later, and we're able to kind of enter back into the story that we had started kind of working through so long before. So that was a felt like a really beautiful and kind of providential continuation of kind of what we're saying here, is that it's not, this is not the end of the story. It may be an important chapter, but it's
Yeah.
ongoing.
A difficult chapter, an
Yeah.
important chapter, a difficult chapter.
Yeah.
Wow. So with this same Christian counselor, was it difficult to pick up the thread of the story? Did he recall? I mean, you said it's been a couple decades since you'd seen him.
Hmm.
Was that a challenge for both of you, for one of you?
No, it didn't feel it to be the case for myself. There was, I mean, of course, some catching up to do, but I
Yeah.
think there was a way in which me kind of being able to kind of reference back to certain moments that were really impressed upon me from that season of my life, and that that time of journeying together, which is the first experience with psychology explicitly I ever had. It was, for me, it was easy to reference back to that and to see the kind of like growth of God's kind of continual providence from that point. And for him, it seemed like he didn't miss a beat. He was able to kind of meet me in that, and have some kind of
Yeah.
context that actually, he was able to kind of step back into with me.
That context memory is an amazing thing when you do clinical work.
Yeah.
If you ask me about X client right now,
Hmm.
I'd have to sit and really think about it for a moment and like remember the details and just kind of pull it all together. It'd take me a few minutes to be able to present information to you about that clinical work. But
Yeah.
when I'm speaking to them, I know the name of their third cousin. It's like
Right.
when you're in that space, somehow it all comes flooding
Yeah.
back.
State dependent, memory. It's quite
Yeah,
amazing.
that's cool. So, well, okay. So big picture then,
Mm.
I mean, I don't know about you, but
Yeah.
for me, whenever I go through, you know, whenever I get raked over the coals or I go through something difficult, I'm always looking to find meaning that I can use to uh, help others, how I can apply it to my life. What can I carry with me? What can I bring forward with me? So, is there anything that you've learned over the last year which is making you a better clinician, which you're gonna take into your clinical work and your ability to help people. I mean, I think I do think experience is. We don't want to say that someone that is inexperienced in life cannot help someone who is older. We don't want to say that because it's untrue. I mean, when I first started out, I was helping geriatric population members when I was in my mid or late 20s, I guess. But there is something to be said in terms of what a clinician can offer as they go through life more and more, living it. Even I could tell you all about marriage before I was married. I could tell you all about being a father before I had kids.
Yeah.
And it's true. It's not as if that information was unhelpful. And in some ways it was maybe even more helpful because I wasn't sucked into it. I just knew the general principles. But taking those principles or even individual work, applying it to yourself, applying it to your life, and then living it in a new way.
Yeah.
I think deepens what you have to say and what you can offer to people in your clinical work.
Yeah.
So what if anything, do you think you'll carry with you into your professional work?
Well, I hope, some of the humility and the compassion and the patience for suffering and the belief in something being worked out redemptively, through God's presence in it, is that much more attuned, through this experience. I recalled, through this last year, the John Paul II's drama, the Radiation of Fatherhood, where he talks about
his play that he wrote.
Yeah.
Yep.
And, the main kind of theme or thesis is, in order to, become a father, we have to return to becoming a child or a son. And so, yes. For me, at least, it's this like recognition that as we walk with people, towards overcoming great challenges or taking on large tasks or kind of evolving in terms of their identity, their vocation, their deeper yes, it's going to, my sense is, inherently bring them to much younger places. It's going to, bring them to, places like I was brought to, where I needed to realize my own dependence on God, my own littleness, my own, need for a father. Especially as
unless you become like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone today, and she was sharing with me. I have a lot of compassion for the 4-year-old girl within me.
Yeah.
But I am really critical of the adult version of me. And it's like, no, hold on a second. The parts of yourself that you're being critical of, that are manifesting in your adult behavior, are actually younger parts.
Yeah, right. Children.
It may not be the 4-year-old part,
right?
But that same compassion you have for that 4-year-old, we might be able to apply that to the teenager who's acting out the way you're acting out.
Yeah.
Or so it's always return.
Mm-hmm.
You think of the self as like a tree, right? With the rings growing within a tree, and that you're always still the child.
Yeah.
You're always maturing, and in a certain sense, it makes sense. It's understandable that we want to break away from childlikeness.
Yeah.
The world demands that we do, right? Things like responsibility and conscientiousness and hard work and virtue building. Like, that's not the same as the freedom of playing on the playground as a child.
Yeah.
My kids don't have to pay bills. Right. So it's necessary that we grow up.
Yeah. And
then it's very paradoxical that even in growing up in an external way, we're called to maintain that childlike simplicity and familial dependency on God that maintains a sort of innocence and purity and clarity of what's important.
Yes.
And it does but that typically gets lost in the world of adulthood and through just being hurt. Like in our life, we get hurt, we lose the innocence, and we start protecting ourselves because we've been hurt.
Right.
And it is quite the challenge to return to that simple, innocent place, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm laughing because I was talking to my wife a little bit earlier, and she's like, "So what are you and Bryan going to talk about tonight?" And I was just like, "I don't know. Probably a few things. Maybe some postpartum issues for men, and and we were just talking about like a few things that her own experience, my own experience, and I said, I just learned something, or at least like it came back around to me as I was just thinking about like my story, and we were just kind of like chatting about it, how amazing it is that when during pregnancy, the father's and after childbirth, the father's testosterone levels drop. Sometimes sometimes up until like 40% drop in
Wow.
testosterone,
Yeah.
and how for uh, a man, a father who's trying to be in control and feeling powerful and feeling
Competent.
competent, there's an incredible challenge, and they look at that as one of the variables to say like, why do certain men, 10% or so, struggle with sometimes some emotional or interior issues, and then the research goes further to say that the reason for that testosterone drop is so that men can be that much more attentive and attuned emotionally. Their normal outward focus start kind of becoming more inward, so that they can be present to their wife and their child. So
Tenderness.
yeah, and so for me, there was a certain, I mean, part of the pain was feeling like that drop hormonally, and for other reasons of a lack of power and control. But like at least one additional layer of redemptive meaning for me was that even in that suffering, and cortisol level does not drop, unfortunately, so stress tends to
Oh man.
rise, testosterone
Yes.
dipped, but the point being is that there is a beautiful redemptive meaning, that even though um, I needed to become more real and honest about becoming a father, like I was able to, and I feel blessed to be present and attuned and there nevertheless. And so it's like
Yeah.
yeah, just one additional layer of meaning that just kind of like we were just kind of unpacking together, just talking about it.
Well, my wife is pregnant right now, so just expect more and more tenderness from me
As your
over
T
the next
levels
couple months.
drop down, right?
I know. I need to take like those Bo Jackson supplements. You ever see these infomercials of this heroes from a bygone era? Doug Flutie, get your T levels back up.
Sure.
Naturally declines with age, and the age doesn't help either. I'm getting older, and I'm a father once again. So, well, listen, I greatly appreciate you coming on. I know a lot of this stuff is it's still tender. It's still raw. I mean,
It
you're
is.
still in the middle of it in some sense. It's not like a complete recovery. I think you're still learning. Recovery might be
Absolutely.
the wrong word, but I mean, it's an
Fair.
ongoing process.
It is. It's an unfolding.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a story that's still being written. And like when you ask me, like, what does that really mean to translate this to day to day life? It's a deeper, I think, allowance of and connection to suffering as really being like a channel for growth and meaning and love
And
and
wisdom. There's
and
no
wisdom. Yeah.
yeah, there's no wisdom that comes outside the context of suffering. That's something people don't understand. You're not going to be old and wise if you don't suffer to get there. You've
Right.
never met anyone wise who hasn't suffered.
Yeah.
Um, so Frisbee golf. Have you played? Have you gotten back to that coping mechanism
I've
since
gotten a
your
few
daughter
rounds
was
in.
born?
Yeah. It's been
Okay.
awesome. I've had a couple of rounds. I did not play well, but I could at that point I could care
Wow.
a whole lot less about how I played. It was just really nice to kind of get out. It's a great place of community. It was my COVID pandemic sport. So that's actually how I got into it. Talk about a time of isolation and the need to at least have some community.
Yes.
So that was
It does. Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying earlier too. I mean, just now it just reminded me of something I was thinking earlier when you said I didn't matter how I played. I was just happy to be out there.
mm,
Uh, how deprivation can give rise to gratitude.
mm,
I was thinking about you were talking about you and your wife. Uh, in the hospital and going down a flight of stairs, for your wife to breastfeed, et cetera, et cetera. But what brought to mind in my experience was how amazing it was after my wife gave birth. I'm thinking about my daughter, my second child, to get up and walk out of the room and take a walk in circles around the hospital wing. Like, I've never appreciated walking more,
Right.
because I wasn't stuck in that room in all that chaos. It was like some form of real life again, walking. I never had gratitude for walking more than in that moment.
Yeah.
And so,
darkness, right? It makes you appreciate, things of light that much more.
Awesome. Well, anything you want to plug? Catholic Psych Institute. If you want to learn how to help people, and if you want to be trained by Dr. Gerard on how to help people, he definitely can help you with that. Or if you need some help,
sure,
we do both. We teach you how to help, or if you need help, we give you help.
Yeah, we got the CP MAP program. A lot of amazing students going through that, and then of course, mentorship program is always there for those who are going through those times and maybe are feeling that prompt, to be the one who's being supported.
Very cool. Well, thanks for coming on.
Hey,
we'll have to have you in again.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.